You've just entered the No Delusion Zone. I'm David Dubato. Today, I'm very pleased to announce our special guest, Stach Luczkiw. Stach is features editor at the Kyiv Post, the largest English language newspaper and media platform in Ukraine. He's also an author. He's had many works published, books of poetry, fiction, nonfiction, and they're all available right now on Amazon.com, Goodreads.com, BarnesandNoble.com, and anywhere they sell quality books. So I encourage you to go there and seek out some of his books. Stach also appears on many podcasts and actually hosts some podcasts in Kyiv, specifically, for the most part, talking about the war. He is, fortunately or unfortunately, an eyewitness to the destruction, to the atrocities, to what's happening right now in Ukraine. And of course, we're going to talk about that. So without further ado, I'm pleased to announce, or invite rather, Stach. Stach, welcome to the No Delusion Zone.
Thank you, David. Thank you for inviting me.
Absolutely. And I'm glad you're safe there in Kyiv. It's not always that way. In fact, you were just mentioning offline here before we went on that you have a bird's eye view from your balcony on
we had a rough
attacks on Kyiv.
Yeah, we had a rough week, especially Wednesday. I think one day there were more than 40 drones, another day more than 70, with a couple of missiles going overhead. But yeah, I have a room quite on a high part of the city. The city has a lot of hills, and I have a balcony. And so it's just tempting you hear the sounds in the distance, and you're watching the air defense working. Fortunately, the air defense so far in Kyiv is working well, in the sense that the only damage has been drone debris falling on buildings and creating fire. But the other cities in Ukraine haven't been as fortunate. Zaporizhia got slammed. Some cities in the west got hit. A few weeks ago, there was an incident in Lviv, which was horrible. A man, a townhouse in the middle of the city got hit. A man, I don't remember whether he came back home or whether he was in the building when it got hit, but he came back home. His wife and 3 daughters were dead, and they had a funeral. It was heartbreaking. It was heartbreaking.
Yes, I read that story. It was just incredible and heartbreaking. And as you had said, you mentioned just off air that sometimes it's actually mesmerizing to watch the anti-aircraft shots, the shells, the rounds coming in off of your balcony. And it reminds me when I was in Iraq. As I told you, I was there during the war, and as horrible as it is, at night sometimes I would go outside and watch the tracer rounds being fired from our machine guns or anti-aircraft emplacements. They're usually red, and follow them in the sky and watch them go. And it was mesmerizing. And then off in the distance, you hear the explosions. Of course, this is a horror show, when I would think about what that actually meant. But when you're in the middle of a war, you have no choice. And it's mesmerizing. It's really quite a surreal scene. So in some ways, I understand what you're going through. Talking about ammunition, artillery shells, what are your thoughts about the incident that happened with President Zelensky recently when he was in the United States on his visit, and all the craziness that the Republicans made about his visit to the ammunition plant in Pennsylvania?
Well, I thought it was a shrewd move on Zelensky's part. I mean, I immediately, when I found out that Sunday that he was on his way to an ammunition plant, and particularly the Scranton ammunition plant that makes 155 millimeter shells, I understood that he was inserting himself into the American elections. It was a shrewd move, because this is something that the Ukrainians really want the Americans to understand, is that it's not a blank check. It's not charity. When the US gives help with weapons and ammunition to Ukraine, it's good for the American economy. It's good for Scranton. It's good for working class Pennsylvania. And this is just a no-brainer that Americans should know about. It's not, there is no blank check. When Patriot missiles get made, if the US government makes a contract to increase production of Patriot missiles, I believe Raytheon makes Patriot missiles, if I'm not mistaken, or is it Lockheed? In any case, both those companies benefit from the United States helping Ukraine out, because Ukraine will be getting what's on stock, and then the United States will have to make new ones to replenish its stock. So I thought it was a good move on Zelensky's part. The Republicans were upset because it was debunking their narrative, essentially, that we're giving Zelensky a blank check and we should concentrate on what's going on at home. But no, that was you can criticize the Biden administration for how they've been slow to help or incremental in helping Ukraine. But the fact remains, Ukraine needs 155 millimeter shells. That's probably the thing they need most. Forget about long range missiles. They need that ammunition. And I know that the Scranton factory ramped up the ammunition, I think twofold maybe in the past year. I don't know the exact numbers, but they need to go tenfold. I mean, they really need to produce more ammunition to help Ukraine. It's good for the American economy. It's good for the American worker. It's good for Ukraine. And I think Zelensky inserting himself into the American election was just a pure survival instinct.
Well, I agree with you, and the reason, of course, that the Republicans made the big stink that they did is because of the impeachment that happened to Trump because of Zelensky. He's never going to forget that. He has very thin skin, as everyone knows. Yeah. And because of that, he hates Zelensky. And since he hates Zelensky, the Republicans hate Zelensky. They will never support him as long as Trump has any kind of power within the Republican Party. So that's the reason behind that. It's pretty obvious to everyone. And in terms of the Biden administration supplying all the 155 and that particular ammunition plant not ramping up 2 or 3 times. Here's the thing, and I've written about this a lot, Stach, and I think you've spoken to it also. We need to go on a wartime footing. So does NATO. I mean, that's obvious, and that's another issue. The United States, whether they want to say it or not, is at war. They're at war with Russia, not on the border there, but they're in a war with Russia. At least Putin thinks so. He says it every day. And we're not even close to ramping up our industry, not so much even our military, our industry on a wartime footing. We're having a hard time keeping up with our own ammunition and weapons needs, much less supply Ukraine with what they need. And I think that's tragic. That is the fault of the Biden administration. And I hope that gets corrected very, very soon. But I agree with you. They need 155 millimeter rounds more than anything else. And I don't think NATO's going to supply them with that. Let's get into that right now, because that's one of my next questions. What do you think about the future of support for Ukraine, specifically from the NATO European partners? And let's, include Germany in there and France and all the rest of them. What do you think?
Well, I think they will support. It's almost impossible not to understand what's the old adage? It takes 2 to make peace, but it only takes one side to make a war. Putin is at war with the collective West, and whether or not we deny it, that's a fact. They consider themselves at war with NATO, and NATO's reason for being is to hold back, at the time, the Soviet Union, Moscow's imperialism. It's spread. So NATO was founded, and now they understand that they'll have to step up and increase production. Unfortunately, everything's slow in Europe. It's very bureaucratic. You have the issue of everything has to be voted unanimously, which is a big problem. The European Union needs reforms. Within NATO, there are problems. NATO's probably a bit easier to handle because effectively the United States has a lot more weight than the other countries, even if not officially, and certainly for all intents and purposes, because they're, they bear the lion's share of the work. Yeah, and what in Latin they say, "Se vis pace, para bellum." If you want peace, prepare for war, and that's what NATO has to do. Otherwise, if Russia is seen to have gained something from this full-scale invasion, that's it. NATO's, for all intents and purposes, finished, because it will slowly eat away at the cohesion for which NATO was, created.
I'll be honest with you. I'm not sure what's going to happen. I'm talking in terms of, say, next year after the American elections, whether or not Harris wins. And I'm talking specifically about the European NATO partners. As you know, Germany just announced that they were slashing their support for Ukraine by 50%. They've also slashed their own defense budget. I don't know how much, but a lot, to the point where I think they're going to increase it about 1%, which is essentially flatlining it. That's very, very discouraging. You've got other knuckleheads like, Orban in Hungary, and what's going on in the not the Czech Republic, but not Slovakia either. The Czech. In Slovenia, I believe, and Italy. You don't know what's going on there. I'm not sure. And you know what it is? It's yes, the European people are very slow to respond to this. They definitely don't want a war with Russia. I get that, but what's letting them down are their leaders. Leaders are supposed to be leaders. They're supposed to lead them. They're supposed to take a leadership role. And even if the public might be against it, they're supposed to do what they believe and feel is in the best interest of their country, of their people. And right now, I believe a lot of the European leaders, especially in Germany, I'll single them out, are looking at their own self-interest. I mean, business interests and political interests, and they're leaving the good of what's good for NATO, what's good for their own country, almost secondary. And to me, that's shameful and disgraceful.
Yeah, I agree. I agree. There's just like it's hard to talk about a single America. There are various factions in America. It's even more so the case in Europe, even in Germany. Although you have Scholz, who's worried about his political future, so he's making concessions, and he has a past of being, if not pro-Russian, then anti-American. Then again, you have interests like Rheinmetall, which is producing a lot of the arms, and you have the Pistorius, the Minister of Defense, who are adamant about rebuilding the German army. That comes with its own problems, given Germans' history. I mean, a lot of European countries, particularly the French and Italians, always, scratch their heads at the idea of Germany developing an army because of history. But so it's always hard getting them all on board. But a lot of it comes from the fact that nobody wants to admit that they're at war. As a matter of fact, Italy, for example, where I'm based, does backflips to say that they're not at war with Russia, and they don't want to be at war with Russia. That's because of business interests. They don't want to let's say, frighten their population, their voter base. Whereas Poland's been buying weaponry and ammunition. They've been spending more than 3% of their GDP. That's unusual, but Poland, you can understand, because Poland is sitting between Russia and Germany. And if Germany is resurgent, then Poland just wants to hedge all its bets and have a prepared army. And then there's the question of, if something happens to NATO, will Article 5, what does Article 5 actually say? That each country will do what it feels is appropriate to defend the others. That could just be nice words, or, words of support or care packages. Will the United States support a Baltic state that gets invaded if, given what we saw happen in Afghanistan, everyone saw that in Afghanistan.
Sure.
We just
Yeah,
pulled out.
well, I'm sorry. If Trump gets elected, the answer to that is no. I'm not naive. It's just not going to happen. I believe with Harris, it would, although she wouldn't want to. The pressure would be too much. So I think that she would. But you know what, Stasha, it comes back to leadership again. The pacifistic and fright in Western Europe and Germany and Italy, as you mentioned, and some other countries, France, is palpable. It's obvious, but as you know, in the last few elections, the radical right and even the radical left, in some cases, won more seats than ever. There's a real problem with radicalism right now, especially on the right. So, the leaders, if any time, need to come out very strongly and speak to their people, lay out the fact that they are at war, and that if they don't take this seriously, they will be part of the Iron Curtain again, or Soviet Union 2.0, with a new Russian empire. I mean, that's what leaders are supposed to do, and they're not. They're burying their heads in the sand. So, of course, there's all kinds of problems going on, domestic and so forth. So the radical right and radical left are filling this vacuum. Again, that's a leadership problem. And we have it here, too. It's not unique to Europe. But right now, it's one of the most dangerous times to have absentee leaders in Europe. And as I said, I'm just not sure what's going to happen as of next year after January 20th.
Well, it depends on who wins the election, right?
Oh, absolutely. Absolutely. Go ahead. No,
with
no.
the European right, I get the sense that the main issue which has spurred the rise of the European right is immigration in Europe. With regard to Russia, most of Western Europe, Germany a little bit, but Italy, no, France, no, neither of those two countries have experienced what Russia can do when it expands. Hungary, Czechoslovakia, yes, but Hungary seems to be experiencing a sort of Stockholm syndrome and
Amnesia. Yeah, definitely amnesia. Yeah.
Yeah.
But like you said, Poland is definitely ramping up, and you expanded on the reasons why. The Baltic states for the same reasons, but the Western, nations of Germany and France and Belgium and Holland and so forth and so on have never really experienced that, and so they're dragging their heels. And obviously, nobody can read the news; they must all be illiterate. Nobody has internet connections apparently because they don't see the atrocities going on in Ukraine, and they all have earplugs in 24/7. And they're looking at Netflix because it's obvious to a brick wall what's going on in Ukraine. Excuse me if I sound upset. I'm pissed off. I mean, the same thing's happening here in America. That's why I'm saying this. MAGA and the right wing and many in Europe are clones. They really are. And until it's too late, what do they used to call it here? NIMBY, not in my backyard. Until it happens to them, they don't want anything to do with it. And it doesn't matter if it's right next door, literally, I mean, in Europe. And I'm just afraid it's going to be too late for that. What do you think about the increased drone production that's going on in Ukraine? That's one of the very, very positive stories coming out of this. Not just drones. The entire industrial base in Ukraine is spectacular.
Well, yeah, the drone production we see it. Ukraine's been hitting Russian facilities on a regular basis, deep inside, and they're producing missiles. Ballistic missiles, cruise missiles. There's just not enough of them. What they need to do is to scale it. The drones, they've managed to increase, but they're never enough. There's never enough ammunition for any general. And to be able to scale it, it's a problem. That's the big problem. The Russians have a command economy. Putin says, produce drones, and they may not be able to produce such cutting edge drones or the tactics. But once they get the ball rolling, once the ship is turning, it's on its way and it's going to happen. Whereas the Ukrainians are still crowdfunding a lot of their ammunition. And it's a wonderful thing to see. It unites society, but I don't know if that's not going to win a war. You need to have the backing of massive industry. You know,
Let me ask you this, Stach. Let me cut right to that because you mentioned it before. Now you're talking about it, and this is a huge point. Yes, the Ukrainian people, and you know this better than I do, are very much still united against fighting Russia. They're in no way looking to give in or to negotiate at this point. But, and there's been a lot of stories recently about an increasing number of Ukrainian deserters. They are still not ramping up, in my opinion, and in many in the military's opinion, their conscription to the point where they, 25, and now they've lowered the age. What about 18? What about 19, 20, 21, 22, 23, as all Western nations do? They're at war for their existence. And since they haven't done that, and you mentioned industry and crowdfunding, if the Ukrainian people, for the most part, are supporting this war effort, and I believe they are, what is with the resistance to a vastly expanded conscription law? And also the government, passing whatever laws are necessary to increase the budget for the defense industry. I understand war fatigue, but I mean, what's behind all of this? I mean, is it getting worse? Where are we at?
The government with the war budget. What was that?
Yeah, I mean, you just mentioned that right now the industry in Ukraine is having to crowdfund a lot of these, whether it's drones or armored vehicles, ballistic missiles, their research and development as well as production. Has the government fallen behind on budget for that? I mean, why are they crowdfunding? Is that tied
because there's never enough money. There's never enough money. There's the usual corruption and incompetence that you get in any war. I mean, even during World War II in the United States, a lot of people
absolutely
out to make a buck. So you've got that, and there's never enough. There's never enough. The West is supplying it, but it's just never enough. And then with the conscription, the official line of the government is it's a delicate balance, particularly with this kind of war, between people you can take up and throw as infantry, but you have to train them. In order to train them, you have to take them out of the economy, right? There's a law of diminishing returns. You take too many people out of the economy, and the economy stops working, and you can't produce all that equipment. So they have to find the right amount, and they have to stagger it in a way that's most efficient. That's what they're saying. The age issue of not conscripting people under 25 probably has to do with it's a psychological resistance here due to the fact that there's a demographic trough of men in their low 20s. They're afraid that they're going to wipe out a whole generation, whereas men in their 30s, they tend to have already had children here in the United States. So there's that issue, but that may change too. A lot of it's just resistance on the part of the Zelensky government, which has been accused of pandering to populism, wanting to remain popular rather than making difficult choices. I'm sure that's partially true, but I wouldn't reduce it to only that. With regard to the desertions, one of our reporters just went out and talked to a few people anonymously about desertions. And the big issue tends to be the fact that there's no demobilization, no rotation. The guys that signed up have been out there for sometime, going on 3 years without being able to get off the front. And there's just a level of exhaustion that's I can't imagine. And so a lot of the resistance isn't to the war per se, it's the way the bureaucracy is handling the mobilization. So it gets subtle, no, it's not that these people are against the war. As a matter of fact, one of the people who went public about his desertion said, "I'm going to be deserting, not because I'm against the war. I'm just against the way the war is being run." which
Stash, that's called for the
still
duration.
insubordination.
It's
But
called for the duration when you go into a war like this. In World War II, all Americans were signed up for the duration. That means to the end of the war. When I went to Iraq, my card, I think, said 15 years or something. Not that we anticipated being there, but it was for the duration. It was at the will of the government, and we knew that. But in a war for your existence, an existential war, which Ukraine is in, nobody wants to be on the front lines 1 minute, much less 2 or 3 years, or open-ended when you don't know if you're going to go home. But I'm sorry, I'm combat vet, and I get it. But it's called for the duration until you win or your country is wiped off the map. And so I'll be honest with you. No, I don't agree with that. I don't get it. I know why, but I don't agree.
yeah, I agree with you. I mean, it's a problem here, even in Kyiv. A lot of men aren't they're dodging. You see it, right? And they're not, some men are living like hermits. On the other hand, it's also a very, they have to manage it in a way where they can use people's skill set. It's a different war in that you got a lot of gaming geeks that are doing the most damage here. And this is unusual. It's not necessarily the infantry. It's the guys that have been playing video games all their childhood and are a bit tech savvy, have sort of an intellectual engineering background, which is gonna be most useful.
Well, no, and you know what? And you're absolutely right. That's a great point. In America, the Army is just starting to realize that and to focus on bringing in the geeks and the nerds and the video game players. And it's starting to reap rewards. That's something that the Ukrainian Army should, and I'm sure they are, starting to focus on. Okay, don't throw everybody onto the front lines in the infantry. Bring all these geeks on from 18 years old on who are just great at video games and flying drones, and put them in there for the duration. And things like that. They've got to think out of the box. I've talked to many senior officials, senior military officials here about that, and they're stunned. A lot of them are stunned about the conscription issue in Ukraine, and they keep saying, well, they're taking all this money from the West, and yet they're complaining they don't have enough, and things are going badly, yet they don't conscript anybody before 25. That's crazy. You can't win a war that way.
Yeah. The other issue is the training, right? One of the probably the biggest reasons why the summer offensive, apart from a lot of the equipment coming late, was they just didn't have enough training to do combined arms breaches, and that was the general consensus of people who know a lot more about the military than I do. I'm not a military specialist by any means.
Well, having said all this about or negative thoughts about Ukraine, please don't get me wrong. I'm a huge supporter of Ukraine, so I'm picking these points out because it's things that I know will confuse me and confuse a lot of military experts of what Ukraine could do better in order to win the war. And you mentioned corruption, and I've actually interviewed some people here from Ukraine that are involved with Slitsvo. For example, Slitsvo TV, who do a lot of investigative work, as you know, there. How bad or good is the situation right now with official or public corruption? Is it any better? Is it the same? Is it worse? What are your thoughts on that?
Well, it's different. It's better, right? And generally, they're getting better. It's still there. There's an attempt to consolidate power within what's called the office of the president. Rather than having a cabinet like most government here in Ukraine, it's a bit of a legacy from Soviet times. You have the office of a president, which the president chooses, and they become. Imagine the National Security Council becoming a shadow government in and of itself, more powerful than even the Congress, right? So it allows one to jump over the checks and balances. And here you have that. You're seeing the office of the president trying to consolidate power, in in many respects to get more efficient people in there, and then in other ways just to get their own men. It's as far as I'm concerned, it's to be expected. I mean, when there's martial law, you need a strong hand, and a dictatorship that's presented like a democracy, sort of along the lines of South Korea after the Korean War. It took at least a decade before they had a government that was, that could be called a democracy. But getting back to one of the issues about conscription and criticism from the West. One of the things that Westerners have trouble understanding about the Ukrainian psyche is that even though the Ukrainians see this as a war, an existential threat, they also understand that this is a multi-generational war. It's not. It goes back 350 years. They've got this massive neighbor to the north, and they're going to have to hold him off. And they're not, and most likely it's not going to happen in one generation. It started in 1917 with the aftermath of World War I, and there was what was called the Russian Civil War, which was mostly fought on Ukrainian territory, and Ukraine declared itself independence. And there were various flare-ups of the independence movement. It's a war of independence, and it's been 31 years since independence. Russia's trying to destroy that, and they will continue to destroy it when the generation of this war, or continue to try to destroy it when the generation of this war is too old to fight. So it's going to have to be the next generation. And they're very conscious of maintaining another generation and teaching the kids, because it's a slow process. You see it in the language issue. It's hard to understand. It's not just a one-off war, the way World War I and II was, or World War I. It's more, let's say, akin to the 19th century, the constant wars between Germany and France, or in previous centuries, England and France. Only you've got, a huge neighbor. The Ukrainians aren't going to change geography. So what they have to do is they have to maintain a society that's capable of resisting, capable of fighting, but also capable of thriving at the same time, maintaining their culture, and turning themselves into what here they often call Israelization, turning yourself into a high-tech, militarized economy. So there's a bit of that tradition, with the Ukrainian Cossacks, which is, they're using these days they're using the Cossack myth to try to, reinforce the soldiers. And there's a lot of that, be tough, fight the war. But there's also the flip side of the Cossack myth is, that they were crazy warriors. They love to attack, but, once they weren't exactly the most organized or orderly fighters at the time. So there are those issues that's hard for a lot of non-Ukrainians to understand. But it's when the war broke out, there was a meme going around Facebook. This is the 8th day of a war that's been going on. This is the 8th day of a 10-year war that's been going on for 3.5 centuries.
Yeah, I hear you, and actually, I do understand that they definitely take the long view, where Westerners, for the most part, don't. And I get that. I guess the only thing I would say about that is that Putin takes an even longer view, and he also wants to exterminate the Ukrainian culture, and he really does. As you know, he wants to exterminate the language, the culture, the people, the country, the borders, and if he was successful, it would be very, very difficult for the Ukrainians to rebuild. They could, as partisans or underground and all that, but it would take a very, very, very long time. But it's possible, and I know that's what they may be thinking about. To me, well, it's much easier to defeat them now than to do that. But what do I know?
No, That's the problem. He's actually doing that in the
Yes.
occupied territories. That's exactly what he's doing. He would like to, there's no doubt in anybody's mind here that he wants to take all of Ukraine and destroy Ukraine as a nation, its national consciousness. Nobody's doubts that. But what they do see is Western help is ambivalent. So if Western help is ambivalent, Ukrainians have to take the long view, and they have to prepare themselves for a decades-long struggle. And that's a very hard, fine, tightrope walk.
No, you're absolutely right. And that really, really upsets me. And I've written and spoken about that a lot. It's one of the questions I have here. I'm not going to ask you, but right now, but it really upsets me that until very, very recently, the Biden administration could not even use the word victory and Ukraine in the same sentence. They kept saying that phrase that I now hate, for as long as it takes, which means absolutely nothing to anyone, especially somebody with a military background. It's insulting, and it's cost untold number of Ukrainian lives and destruction to the infrastructure and the nation, the country of Ukraine. So look now, and so I understand they're between a rock and a hard spot. They need to take the long run because the West, led by the United States, has never really articulated a plan, an end goal for Ukrainian victory, just supplying them with barely enough weapons and ammunition to survive another day. Maybe that will change. Again, we don't know. The next few months will tell. So in a way, Stach, you're right. They have to take the long view, whether they want to or not right now.
And even whatever view they take, the Ukrainians, when you're here in Kyiv, we get slammed by drones. They knock out some energy, and everyone just stoically looks and kind of has this attitude. Is that all you got? That's all you got? Right? We can survive that. And same thing, they're not going to destroy Ukraine. You saw that. The Ukrainians knew they wouldn't, it's just all the think tanks, Russia specialists thought it would fall in 3 days. But the people who were here and actually watching what was going on, they knew that the Ukrainians were going to resist. And a lot of people tend to overestimate Russian capacity. Not that they're good soldiers, they'll keep fighting, but the Ukrainians understand how they fight, and they'll resist. They have no choice.
When I say that Russia's, Putin is looking to exterminate Ukraine and commit genocide with Ukrainian culture, I don't mean that he's going to be successful. He's going to do a lot of damage, even if the West pulls out and Trump wins and there's a disaster and a catastrophe with Western support. I don't believe he's going to be successful for the reasons you just said. The Ukrainians are too resilient. They're too stubborn. They're too inventive. They're too brave. Whatever word you want to use, they're incredible. As far as I'm concerned, they're an absolute miracle for the Western world. They're a poster child for what democracies should be. Defensive democracy should be. I just think that it's too bad that we, the West, haven't supported them to the point where they could have won, in my opinion, if we had supported them with the kinds of weapons, ammunition, and training that Zelensky has been begging for 2.5 years. I really believe Ukraine would win right now. Putin would either be dead or he would have retreated or made some excuse to pull Russian forces out of Ukraine. But it didn't happen. So again, the next few months will tell what kind of support we give them. Talking about that, Kursk, where are we at with Kursk and Ukraine? In your opinion, what do you see? Are they going to advance past where they're digging in now and fortifying the positions? What do you think? You doubt it?
No, I think they, if anything, they'll try to widen the space, but they're not going to go deeper. I don't think they have the men to do it. It was to pick up the morale. It was to establish a sort of bargaining chip for negotiations. It was also, some people interpret it as a very clever move on Zelensky's part, because there were rumors that the United States was pressing Zelensky to negotiate with Putin. After Ukraine invaded Russia, Putin's not going to negotiate. So that kind of takes the pressure off him from the West of being forced to negotiate. And on top of that, it's a bargaining chip. It was a real gamble. They could have gone deeper, but in any military, there's plan A, plan B, and if that doesn't work, but it was a gamble. They left a lot of troops exposed down in the Pokrovsk region. Vuhledar fell today, so it was a ballsy move for sure.
Well, it was a spectacular success, though, on many, many levels. If nothing else, for the morale that you had mentioned. I wasn't there, of course, but I can't even imagine the positive boost that it gave to the morale of of not only the military, just the ordinary Ukrainians. It must have been incredible.
Yeah, to invade Russia and to go in there. So it just goes to show that we can still continue this for a while. It's eventually, people here often have a fatalist. Eventually, Putin will die. All empires end sooner or later. The Russian Empire is pretty much finished. They just haven't realized it yet. They're still like the French in the 50s and 60s, hanging on to their Indochina and Algeria, and the Russians just haven't accepted the fact that their empire is finished.
Well, to me, what's really indicative of the attitude of the Russian people outside the Kremlin and the oligarchs in that circle is the fact that a foreign military, the Ukrainian army, invaded Russia. Since the first time since 1945, there is a foreign army on the ground, on the territory of Russia, fortifying it. They're there, they're going to stay. And the attitude of the Russian people, for the most part, is, so what else is new? They're just not interested. And yes, most of them don't even know what's going on there. I understand. But the ones that do, from what I've seen and read, and I actually have contacts still in Russia, they really don't give a damn. It's just part of the whole thing where they don't get involved in politics. They don't want to talk about it. It's no big deal. And to me, that's really telling of the Russian people. You've got a foreign army. Your enemy right now is controlling an oblast or a good part of an oblast region of your country. You really don't care. It's no big deal.
Yeah, it's historically it's not unprecedented. Everyone says it's the first time Russia was invaded since World War II, which is technically not true. I think the Chinese took a little island in the middle of a river in the 50s, but this is the land of scorched earth policy. They've been doing scorched earth since the Scythians. It's an old trick. They're more than willing to give up territory to get it back later on, whether it's the Ukrainians. But what you pointed out is it's indicative of very differing characteristics of the Russian national psyche and the Ukrainian national psyche. The Russians tend to be, just whatever the Tsar, whatever the man in charge said, that was good for us because 90% of the population were serfs. Whereas the Ukrainian national psyche developed from Cossacks who re-entered this land that was very sparsely populated after the Mongols razed everything, and they were on the edge of whether the Polish lands and then later the Muscovite lands, and they were over the centuries they just ruled themselves. There was no one around to rule them on a day-to-day basis. They were free people.
More or less a democratic form of government.
Yeah, militaristic democracy. True.
Yeah, yeah.
So it's different. It's there's the Ukrainians are much more apt to just flip someone the finger and just say, "Get out of here," Go fuck
well, yeah,
yourself.
and that's the only reason I brought it up. To be honest, Dash, is not that it's totally unprecedented. It's just to show the difference actually between the Ukrainian psyche and the Russians. Where since 2014, the Ukrainians have been going crazy, and after 2022, they're at war. They're doing everything they can to defend their territory. Where with the Russians, you got the Ukrainian army there, and it's like, do we have any more borscht? It's not a big deal. It's a totally different attitude. And what did they do? What do they do? The people in Kursk and Belgorod Oblast, what they've done to the Tsar for hundreds of years. They write letters to the Tsar, literally. Vladimirovich, help us. We need help. We need our homes are gone. We need blah, blah, blah. They've been doing that for hundreds of years. They don't fight back. They just ask the Tsar for help, and he ignores them. Yeah. It's to me, it's disgusting, but that's the Russians. That's the mysterious Russian soul. I just did a podcast on that.
The mysterious Russian soul. I mean, they were serfs. For 90% of the population were serfs until what, 1861?
I think they still are, in my opinion.
They still are, and not much has changed. You have an elite, and there's a power struggle among elite. It's a vertical, and they haven't been exposed to the movements in Europe, like the Renaissance or the Reformation. So you had a governmental structure. It was all top down, and that comes from the Mongols. Whereas Ukraine was exposed to the Polish kingdom, and the Polish kingdom had a sort of monarchy ruled by the aristocracy, and I think something like 20% of the population was aristocracy. So it was a form of parliamentary monarchy, predating Britons.
Well, you made a really great point in the terms of the fact that Russia never experienced the Age of Enlightenment. They never went through the Renaissance. They never had even castles. They're still, Russians today are just, and that's why they love Western films. A lot of it, they don't see that. It doesn't exist. Knights in shining armor, castles, the Renaissance, Da Vinci, all the things that they were never exposed to. So they just don't get it. To them, they still have a czar. It's just a totally different culture. Let me ask you one of the last questions about that, if I could, to follow up. What's the sentiment in Ukraine right now, or even personally, about the future of Putin? What's going to happen to him as far as the prevailing opinion in Kyiv right now?
Well, he's going to die. We all will, right? Sooner or later, he's going to die. He's 71 years old. Tops, right? Is he going to live like as long as Jimmy Carter? I doubt it. He's going to die sooner or later, and then there's going to be some sort of power struggle in Russia. The new guy, people often say, oh, the new guy, whoever takes Putin's place, might even be worse. I don't buy that for a second, because one of the reasons why Putin is so dangerous, even if someone else could be crueler and more Stalin-like, is the fact that Putin has had 20 years to consolidate power, and he's consolidated it very well by Russian standards. So anyone who takes his place will have to deal with a power struggle and reconsolidate his own power base. That's not going to be easy. It never is in a country as vast as Russia. So when Putin dies, it'll be easier for Ukraine. One of the things I wanted to say earlier, the difference in the national, characters, is one of the reasons that Putin's so terrified of a democratic Ukraine, is that he's afraid that this democratic contagion is going to spill over into Russia the way it did into Belarus, and jeopardize his hold on power. And there was a running joke these past 10 years about Ukraine. It's like, Ukraine is the only place in the world where you could say whatever you want in Russian. People speak Russian all the time. I'm in an office. More people speak Russian than Ukrainian. We're in the middle of Kyiv. It's not an issue. Everyone's bilingual.
You mean in the Donbass, Russian speakers weren't tortured?
It's crazy.
I thought little babies were even tortured if they spoke Russian.
Even Prigozhin said that was a lie, that was completely...
But the Russian people believe it for the most part. That's what's disgraceful and disgusting. Not all of them, but too many of them.
Well, they have to force themselves to believe it, because otherwise they might have to act. Their consciences might tell them they'd have to act. And there's this... in a lot of the ex-Soviet spaces, there's this sort of double thing going on. You say one thing, but you think another thing, which is why it's always difficult to trust opinion polls. For me, not even here in Ukraine, it's difficult because, you talk to people publicly, they say one thing, but they're all capable of of thinking otherwise, which is one of the things that a lot of people don't know. A lot of people who are calling, why doesn't Ukraine just give up some territory and cut a deal? You get that. My sense here, talking to Ukrainians and living with Ukrainians and being Ukrainian myself, is almost everyone would cut a deal and give up territory tomorrow if we had security guarantees, a real security guarantee like NATO. But that's not happening. We still remember the Budapest Memorandum of 1994. And without that security guarantee, you can't even say it publicly that you're willing to give up territory. Zelensky can't say it publicly. Everyone knows what he's thinking, and everyone's more or less on the same page. You can't say that because it would just completely destroy your negotiating position. You need a security guarantee, whether that's NATO or some sort of super weaponry, we know what kind, in the future, right?
Well, that was going to be my last question, actually, if I could, Stach, is the level of support for the majority of the Ukrainian people for continuing this war should a Trump take power, or even a Harris, and they are pushing Zelensky to negotiate a land for peace deal. What do you think would be the attitude of the majority of the Ukrainian people if that were the case?
It'd probably be against it. I don't know if Zelensky could pull it off. I don't think his, it's not a dictatorship, even though, maybe some people around Zelensky wish it were. Ukrainians go to the streets. We saw that in 2014. They go into the streets. They've tasted freedom. That's what it's about. 30 years ago, they've tasted freedom. We're not going to give it up. We're not going to give it up. You want to cut a deal to give Putin a chance to catch his breath and to attack us again, because that's what he's going to do. It's not going to fly with most Ukrainians, and it's not enough to push Zelensky. People think like Moscow and Washington run the world, and that completely denies agency not only to the Ukrainian government but especially to the Ukrainian people. We're at a historical watershed, and everyone's very conscious of that. And everyone's very conscious of the fact that we're fighting for Western democracy here. This is the front line. The world will move westward if we don't stop them here, just like they stopped the Mongols. Same thing.
Zelensky, the Ukrainian government, and especially the Ukrainian people are in my opinion, a shining example to what defense of democracy should be. I know I said that before, but I just have to say it again. And it would be a real disgrace if the American people, the American government, whoever takes office next January, does not allow them, does not give them the tools to be victorious over Russia. It would just be a disgrace. And I just really pray that doesn't happen.
Yeah, I agree. And as a U.S. citizen, I see this as a golden opportunity for the United States to reestablish itself as the leader of the free world. Right? It's black and white. It's good against evil as much as any war and World War, since World War II. Putin must be stopped. The United States can do it without sending boots on the ground, just by helping Ukraine, and the world would be better off. They're just too scared, too cautious.
We'll have to leave it at that. On that note, we agree. And as I said several times during this discussion, I don't know what's going to happen in the next few months, regardless of who wins the election. If Trump wins, it's obvious which way it's going to go. But even if Harris wins and the Democrats win, it's still no guarantee as to the level of support that the United States is going to continue to give to Ukraine. I can only hope so. Stach, thank you very much for a great discussion. Let's do it again. And please, in Kyiv especially, take care, stay safe, and as I tell everyone, stay sane.